Peter Eltsov, historian, political scientist, and professor at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., here with me in the studio. Peter, hi.
Hi. First of all, congratulations on the forthcoming Independence Day tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Just straight to the point. Putin and his team are doing everything possible to avoid a direct meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. At one point, they suggest involving Ukrainian security guarantees. At another, they mockingly propose holding talks in Moscow. What is Putin afraid of? What could a dictator fear who has spent years, mocking and humiliating Ukrainian president?
Well, let me say first, I'll provide my commentary. I would like to clarify, I don't speak on behalf of the Department of Defense. This is my purely own opinion. So a couple factors. If you noticed, Putin, even like after the meeting with Donald Trump, he refused to talk to the journalists. So Donald Trump gave him that favor, basically not speaking directly to the journalists. And if you see the American journalists trying to ask him questions, shouting at him, they were pretty tough questions. So I don't think he can handle today, particularly after these 3 years of war, brutal war, like all these casualties. It will be difficult, even with his patience and tolerance and sort of demeanor, it will be difficult for him to handle a room of independent journalists, because I think there will be insults, there will be International Criminal Court, so he's not welcome in many countries. This was basically his first visit since the full-scale war in Ukraine to the Western world, and says that Zelenskyy illegitimate. This is, of course, ludicrous. I believe it's by your law you can hold the elections during the war, and it would be very damaging, probably politically, have elections in Ukraine during the war. So, and it's particularly sounds so ludicrous from Putin because many world leaders in international organizations consider him completely illegitimate. He hadn't had a free elections in years and years, and then his major opponents were either jailed, killed, or kicked out of the country. And then there is a personal moment. I mean, regardless of how brutal Putin is, I think the eye-to-eye meeting with Zelenskyy would be quite a test for both of them. So he just doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to face the consequences. Another factor, I think Zelenskyy is actually ready for much more concessions to stop the war, to get the ceasefire than Putin. So Putin doesn't have much to offer. He wants more land and he wants more war.
Peter,
so what's the point?
Peter, how do you know that Zelenskyy is ready for concessions?
Well, I think what I read, I don't know what Zelenskyy is ready, but I think what I read, at least in the news, that the Ukrainian government is really willing to have a ceasefire, not legal concessions. Okay. They definitely don't want to recognize anything legally. But if you think even the Baltic states, their incorporation in the Soviet Union was never legally recognized by the United States. So the situation like in Kashmir or in Korea, where there is a line of control, I do think that the Ukrainians would like to have a ceasefire if Putin suggested a ceasefire. Definitely so. That's what I mean, a concession. Putin doesn't even want a ceasefire.
Okay, I see. But in a similar political situations, where do representatives of countries usually meet? Because Putin suggested Moscow, then they suggested something similar to Moscow, but Budapest. Don't see any much difference between these cities. So from your perspective, where do usually political representatives meet in such of situations?
So this is very individual, I think. You can't really draw direct historic parallels. I'll tell you, meeting in Europe, would be a big challenge even in a country like Budapest, which is friendly. Think about it. Orban tried to ban a gay parade in Budapest. And instead, as a protest, there were so many people from all over Europe, including some senior politicians, came to participate in the gay parade. Think how many Ukrainians are in Europe today. I can say personally, I travel to Europe. I mean, in Prague, Russian and Ukrainian are basically the second language today. You hear it everywhere. So there is Russian opposition, there is the Ukrainian refugees. Think of a logistical nightmare for security services of Putin to keep him out of those demonstrations and protests. So I think a more plausible place for them to meet would be something like Saudi Arabia or Emirates, which are pretty authoritarian states, and they could control the order there. Then in Europe, of course, many countries are not supposed to receive Putin because, again, as I said, he is indicted by the International Criminal Court. So, like, I would say, I mean, of course, Moscow, the suggestion of Moscow is ludicrous. It's just, I mean, Zelensky should not be traveling to Moscow, and he won't. But I would say the most, ideally, the most plausible state would be the Turkey, which also has a lot of Ukrainian refugees, or better would be like somewhere in Dubai or Qatar.
But basically, it will not happen, right?
I think it's possible that it will happen. It depends very much on the facilitation of Donald Trump, because he constantly changes his opinion now. He says one day, I'm going to participate. I'm not sure I'm going to participate. I'm going to help Ukrainians. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll get out of the conflict. So we don't know. The way the meeting with Putin in Anchorage was organized was so hectic, fast, and unpredictable. So we may hear like they're meeting somewhere in like 5 days. That's possible. But I think it's very unlikely that it will happen, in my view, without President Trump. So, I mean, it's definitely the atmosphere would be much better with facilitation. And ideally, there needs to be a fourth person, a representative of the European Union.
Okay, I see. But please correct me if I'm wrong. Putin clearly wants diplomatic victories at Trump's expense. Phone calls, that was first. Then was a meeting on the US soil. And now the idea of Trump coming to Moscow. Am I reading this correctly?
Well, first of all, Trump did not answer the question whether he would be coming to Moscow. And if you watch the press conference with Putin carefully, he actually says, which of course the Russian propaganda cut off that part, because he says in the beginning, it's an interesting idea, but then he adds, I'll be under a lot of fire or something like that. I don't know exact words he used. So he realizes that for him going to Moscow will be pretty scandalous, and I don't know whether he's going to do it. I mean, we completely don't have an answer to that from Donald Trump. But regarding diplomatic victories, many commentators today say that for Putin it was actually a huge breakthrough because he came to the United States. He was also noticeably received on the military base. Think about it also logistically, how much easier to protect him there from demonstrators. There are many protesters in the United States who absolutely would not want to see him in any major city. So Trump would need to involve the military to basically patrol the streets and so forth. But yes, he wants diplomatic victories, but I generally support talking. So I do think that it's important for the United States president to meet with Putin to discuss things and to see whether there are any ways of de-escalating. Not talking is not helpful either. So I would not give Putin a total victory here. Definitely not in the eyes of the Western media.
Do you think Ukrainians ever will forgive American soldiers who were putting on their knees and, lying this red carpet to Russian murderer?
Yeah, this was unnecessary. I'll just be very brief. This is unnecessary. Yeah. There are some elements which are unfortunate, but I think generally, someone needs to talk to him.
Yes.
So
But do you, Peter, do
actually, to
you?
give a credit to the Germans, the French, Macron, I think, tried to talk to him. The Germans try, so he just doesn't talk to anyone except, I guess, for Trump.
Yes. And is it possible that for Putin to, to demonstrate Trump that he's ready for any kind of a peace efforts and demonstrate to him a peace efforts, he will agree at least to virtual summit? I was reading about that idea. Is that even possible?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't bet on it. And I think the question is, we are waiting. Is Putin ready for any kind of negotiations? As I said before in your show, talking to you, that Putin wants more land. To me, it's absolutely obvious that what he's got is not enough for him. And it's ludicrous when I hear some American political analysts like John Mearsheimer or journalist Tucker Carlson or Orban who are saying that Ukraine has already lost the war. I mean, this is just incredibly incorrect statement. Ukraine actually hasn't lost any big major city except for Mariupol, which I don't consider that big on the scale of the whole country. So he wants more land. So, I'm pretty pessimistic. Yes, he wants more land, and he doesn't want a ceasefire. Even a ceasefire would be an incredible victory for Ukraine for the time being, at least to get a pause in fighting. He doesn't want to stop. It doesn't seem like at all.
Peter, let's switch our conversation into another topic, but also very, very important. Russian occupiers are systematically removing Ukraine's cultural heritage, museum exhibits, artists' works, old prints, icons. They even took away the remains of Potemkin. Is this a deliberate removal of our Ukrainian heritage with the aim of appropriation?
Yes, it's absolutely deliberate. Moreover, they recently passed the law, so they made it totally legal. So basically, all Ukrainian heritage on the occupied territories automatically becomes Russian. But apparently, they're afraid even of that Ukraine may get these lands back, because even from Crimea, they remove cultural heritage, move more to central Russia, to Moscow, and like in the old colonial days, to St. Petersburg. A huge part of it you didn't mention is Ukrainian archaeology. Ukraine is a treasure trove for archaeology, particularly if you consider Crimea. That's a mixture of Greco-Roman archaeology with medieval archaeology, with the Mongol archaeology, with Byzantium, and so forth. So also there is a sequence of cultures all over Ukraine, very well studied. And of course, the Scythians, for some reason, the Russians consider themselves in this nationalist rage, the descendants of the Scythians. You may remember the famous nationalist poet by Alexander Blok, where he says, "We are the Scythians, we are the slit-eyed Asians. Try to wage war with us, you'll try no more." So they clearly consider themselves now the descendants of the Scythians. And if you think Scythian archaeology, the most valuable archaeology is from Ukraine. All these kurgans under Peter the Great, and later under the Tsars were removed and brought to St. Petersburg Hermitage. Well, okay, these were colonial days. This was the center of the empire. The British, the Germans, the French did the same, but they're doing this today again. I just recently read an interview, was shocked with the director of the St. Petersburg Hermitage, Mikhail Piotrovsky, who is, of course, the son of the previous famous director and famous archaeologist, Boris Piotrovsky, that he is vehemently supporting the war. He could at least stay neutral and not say much. He does support the war 100%. And if you look at the history of the Hermitage Museum, even under Stalin, people like Orbelli were trying to resist the Soviet government, for example, on the sale of antiquities to the West or on the sale of the art. So they had more stamina even under Stalin than today. This is horrible. This is deliberate. This is disgusting. And I'll draw for you one parallel. So when the United States invaded Iraq, if you remember, the Baghdad Museum was looted, which was a horrendous thing to do, I think, because the US troop could have easily prevented it from happening. Of course, they didn't do it themselves, but they still could have prevented. But the Bush administration was under such a tremendous pressure for about 2-3 weeks from the American Anthropological Association, American Historical Association, that they had to do something. They started hiring archaeologists, anthropologists, linguists galore to try to help and save the Iraqi antiquities and cultural heritage. Of course, this is one of the cradles of civilization. So the Russians not only not saving anything and destroying stuff, they're also stealing this stuff, appropriating this stuff. I mean, this is disgusting. And what I think needs to be done in response, Ukraine needs to be really aggressive about defining its cultural heritage. Several museums in the world now renamed the labels under several artists because they started reconsidering who's really Russian and Ukrainian, because the Russians claim everything to be basically Russian. Nothing is Ukrainian. Today, for example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art calls the famous artists of the so-called Russian vanguard. Now they don't call it anymore Russian. It's Kazimir Malevich, who lived in Kiev for years, and some researchers say considered himself a Ukrainian, spoke Ukrainian. Even Ilya Repin, it needs to be if Russians are stealing Ukrainian art, Ukrainians need to be aggressive about claiming what should be and is Ukrainian.
If Russia creates SVO museums in the occupied territories to display looted items, isn't this a new form of legalizing crime through culture?
Oh, absolutely. But you see, they deny completely. The Ukrainian culture to them doesn't exist as such. It's just something rural, something from the villages. The Ukrainian language is portrayed as a kind of a broken language. And today, the horrid situation that one of the reasons of their war was the alleged persecution of the Russian language in Ukraine, which has never happened. And I can attest to that. I was in Ukraine after 2014, and the Russian was freely spoken. But now they are actually in occupied territories, banned the Ukrainian language. So yes, this is an attempt to legitimize what they're doing. And they have these museums of this, special, what they call special military operations. What can you say? This is a very tragic situation. It's almost how the Nazis did what they did in occupied territory without any consideration for cultural heritage. I think one of your archaeologists has recently suggested, I saw in the news, that Ukraine needs to have more of a representative of cultural heritage management embedded with the army and working on basically recording what is being lost and what is being stolen. I believe they took the entire Kherson Museum, the collection, at the short period of occupation and transported it to Russia.
Yeah, and it feels like the problem with this is that Russians, they don't believe they are stealing. They don't think they are stealing.
They think but you see, they don't think they're conquering anything. They're thinking the whole thing is theirs. As Putin said, I believe it was in St. Petersburg Economic Forum, he again repeated this nonsense that the Ukrainians and the Russians are the same people. But then he says, in this saying, all of Ukraine is ours. So if they say all of Ukraine is theirs, so they're just bringing it back. In their language, they're liberating Ukraine, right? So if they're liberating, they're basically bringing back what is Russian. It's not Ukraine in their view. And it's generations. This is a return of 100% territorial colonialism. And even in a sense, it's almost worse than colonialism under the empires, like old-style empires, because even the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, conquered the Balkans, like what is Serbia today. They didn't consider them Turkish, right? Or when even the Russian Empire would conquer Finland, it was the Russian Empire, but it wasn't Russia. Today, Ukraine is portrayed as Russia, period, at least most of it. And I think I suspect, maybe except for Galiciana, in Putin views, everything else is historic Russia.
It's super depressing to hear, to be honest. Super depressing to hear.
Yes, it's basically an annihilation of entire nation, identity, history. It's a horrible thing. I mean, in the 21st century, if you think we are back to basically pre-World War I mentality. And again, I say in many respects, it's worse even than in those times, because these were purely imperial conquests. Now it's a denial of the entire nation, language, culture, heritage, or everything. And they also, which is ludicrous, they try to say that the Russian culture has been canceled. I live in America. I'm sick, like almost. I love Tchaikovsky, but they play probably, like I would say, I drive a lot to work, and there is this classical radio, and I would say like 20% of music is Russian music, probably classical music. The same in the theaters. I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, just a couple of years ago. They have the Russian drama theater, it's still called the Griboyedov Theater. So this is complete lies that the culture has been canceled. I was in Amsterdam just less than a year ago. There was a concert of Prokofiev there. A friend of mine invited me. So this is just absurd. They cancel people like Gergiev and do it justly so. Like, of course, like Gergiev has been compared with I actually wrote a piece 10 years ago, was attacked, where I compared Gergiev with Wilhelm Furtwängler, which was a super famous conductor. He was a Hitler's conductor. And after the war, he was offered a job in America, and all American Jewish musicians said they'll never play with him. So the offer was rescinded. But so, yes, the person like Gergiev or maybe Netrebko or people who are closely associated, or Yuri Bashmet, but no one is canceling the culture. This is nonsense.
And going back to Crimea, can the destruction of the Bakhchisarai Khan's palace be considered cultural genocide of the Crimean Tatar? And does the West understand the scale of this crime?
Yes, it's horrendous. Generally, as you know, the Crimean Tatars overwhelmingly supported being part of, they wanted being part of Ukraine, so staying in Ukraine, and Crimea staying with Ukraine, because they've been persecuted for years in Russia. They were considered, first of all, we know about genocide, resettlement, but then they were never considered with this bigotry and racism. They were never considered equal to the Russian people. And Crimea, historically, if anyone can claim this land historically, more recently, it's the Crimean Tatars, because before Catherine the Great conquered Crimea. So yeah, that's a horrible crime. And of course, one of you, Umerov, is a Crimean Tatar, right?
Yes.
Your politician. So
yes.
you have
Minister Umerov. Yes.
Yes. So you have Crimean Tatars in your government, which is, I can imagine that happening, for example, in Russia. So yes, this is a horrendous thing to do.
And the theft of Kuinji and Ivazovsky from Mariupol, is this also Russia's attempt to prove that Ukrainian art doesn't exist and everything belongs to the Russian world?
Yes, it's absolutely true. I'm very happy to see in the West, like, for example, I noticed recently a museum in Basel, Switzerland, had an exhibition which was called Born in Ukraine, where they had Ilya Repin, Ivan Ivazovsky, David Burley.
I saw that too.
Burley.
I saw in Switzerland, you said.
Yeah.
Yes, I saw that last year. Mm-hmm.
And a museum in Köln went even further in Germany. So they had an exhibition, Ukrainian Modernism, 1920s, 1930s, and they had Alexander Bogomazov, Kazimir Malevich, and David Burluk. So the Russians are furious. I have a quote for you, Mikhail Shvydkoy, who was at the time the international culture envoy to Vladimir Putin, whatever it means. He accused the West of a process of abolishing Russian culture. It's particularly in the case of the Metropolitan Museum, which changed the labels with a country of origin. And he said this lame political gesture has trumped all legitimate cultural considerations. They're furious. Yes, and then I could give you an example. Of course, there are people in every culture. There are marginal people who shared by different culture. Many Parisians think of Pablo Picasso as the French artist, while people in Spain, of course, think of him. He was born in Spanish as a Spanish artist. But what I said earlier, that Ukraine needs to be very aggressive in this direction, claiming its own culture, and the best example is Israel. How good they are in that. For example, they recently bought the remaining manuscripts of Franz Kafka, unpublished manuscripts, because they consider him 100% Jewish. And this is the writer who wrote in German, lived in Prague. So, I mean, what is his identity? And it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. Israel said 100%, he is one of our own. So Ukraine needs to do the same, I think, with whoever you consider part of your culture, part of your heritage, claim it unapologetically.
And could Russia's attempts to sell Ukrainian relics on the black market become its weak point, since this makes the stolen items treasurable and ultimately compromises the state, the Russian state?
Well, I don't think the state will be trying to sell it, but of course there is a lot of black market, and people have already been caught, I believe, in the United States with stolen Ukrainian archaeological artifacts. So they, I mean, I hope the international community helps. It's the same like there was a huge trade of illegal trade of antiquities took place during the war in Afghanistan and in Syria. So we may see this, of course, happening in Ukraine. And I saw that there were actually reports of illegal excavations in occupied areas of Ukraine. I worked with the Russian archaeologists. I know their school pretty well, and I can tell you that their methods are generally considered very unscientific, in a sense that they're it's more like lootering. And so they're already doing it. I read some reports that there is evidence on the occupied territories of Ukraine.
Yeah, I hope that the justice will find all the stolen by Russia Ukrainian culture, art, and piece of arts, and someday they will get back to Ukraine. I hope for that.
Right. Of course, with Kiev and Rus, that's another, like everything coming from like ancient Rus, they consider that their own. So they'll never return it back to Kiev. So,
no,
or at least try to keep it forever.
Who knows? Maybe under Putin not, but maybe in 20, 30 years, it may be possible. I don't know. It's just my guess, my hope.
Yeah. I think the language, I mean, the last point I would like to make, I'm actually writing a piece about it. I think I forgot the name of the, have it here, one of your political figures, Gennady Gufman. He once jokingly said that, and I think not so jokingly, that the Russian language in Ukraine needs to be renamed into the East Ukrainian. So if you look at the history of political linguistics, there is a Tajik and Farsi, which are same languages, but for political reasons have different names. There is a Hindi and Urdu, which used to be the same pretty much language, became different languages. There is Finnish and Estonian, Azerbaijani, Turkish and Moldovan and Romanian, which many now politicians in Moldova and Romania say that was a political imperial game to rename those languages, that it's actually one language, Romanian. So it could go the other way around, because even language can be appropriated, I think. I mean, that would be a very good idea. Just don't call it Russian anymore. I agree with Gutman.
Absolutely. Peter, thank you so much.
I know it may be too much of a provocative suggestion.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Peter. And we have to, unfortunately, round up. But as always, it's always a pleasure to speak with you and to listen to you, and hope to see you again in our studio.
Thank you.